Thank you. All right, welcome to the regular meeting of the City of Highland Park Zoning Board of Appeals on Thursday, May 18th, 2023. I think the first thing we should do is, Carl, can we get a roll call for attendance purposes, please?
Yes. Member Trushansky.
Here.
Member Beck.
Here.
Member Yablon.
Present.
Member Zaransky is absent. Member Hendrick is absent. Vice Chair Bay.
Here.
Chair Cullither is absent. There's a quorum for business this evening. Also, I will call out Council Liaison Tapia is present. And then my name is Carl Burhoff. I'm a senior planner with the Community Development Department, and we have two members of the city's Corporation Council here this evening, and then two student reps this evening.
Okay, thank you. All right, the first order of business is, my understanding is we have 3 sets of minutes to approve, and I assume we should approve them each individually. Has everyone had a chance to review? Has everyone had a chance to turn off their cell phones and to review the first minutes of March 16th, 2023?
Aye.
All right, if so, I would entertain a motion.
I will move to approve the minutes as presented in the packet.
A second.
Okay, Carl, we have a motion by Member Beck, seconded by Member Yeblon, to approve the minutes on March 16th. Can we get a roll call?
Thank you, Chair. Member Trushansky.
Aye.
Member Beck.
Aye.
Member Yablon.
Aye.
Member Zaransky is absent. Member Hendrick is absent. Vice Chair Bay.
Aye.
Chair Cullither is absent. That motion passes 4-0.
Okay, we'll move on to the minutes from the meeting of April 20th, 2023. I would entertain a motion.
Member Beck will move to approve the minutes as presented in the packet.
Member Trushansky seconds.
Okay, that's a motion by Member Beck to approve the minutes of April 20th, seconded by Member Trushansky. Can we get a roll call vote, please, Carl?
Thank you. Member Trushansky.
Aye.
Member Beck.
Aye.
Member Yablon.
Aye.
Member Zaransky is absent. Member Hendrick is absent. Vice Chair Bay.
Aye.
Chair Cullither is absent. That motion passes 4-0.
All right, and finally, the minutes, I'll recognize Member Yeblon.
Carl, sorry, quick question. If there's only 4 of us and say one of us hasn't watched the video, so cannot approve said minutes, and so I would need to abstain if we were to vote on this?
Okay, so yeah, that's actually, we're in luck that we have Corporation Council here this evening, because these are not approval orders. Approval orders need 4 affirmative votes. These are minutes, so do our Corporation Council, can a majority of a quorum pass the minutes, or do we need 4 votes for the minutes as well?
For the minutes, unless, and I defer to Hart, I would say majority is sufficient.
Okay, I see Hart Passman nodding in agreement, so we will proceed on that assumption. I will also state for the record, I was absent for the May 4th meeting, but I did in fact review the video, so I can vote, and accordingly, I would entertain a motion to approve those minutes.
Member Trushansky seconds.
You're making the motion.
Oh, yeah. Member Trushansky makes the motion to approve the minutes.
Member Beck will second.
Okay, that's a motion by Member Trushansky, seconded by Member Beck to approve the minutes of May 4th. Can I get a roll call vote now?
Yes. Okay, thank you. Member Trushansky.
Aye.
Member Beck.
Aye.
Member Yablon.
Abstained.
Member Zaransky is absent. Member Hendrick is absent. Vice Chair Bay.
Aye.
And Chair Cullither is absent, so that motion passes 3-0 with 1 abstention.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, I will just state for the record, the publication date for new business for this meeting was May 3rd, 2023. Item 4 on the agenda is business from the public. Is there anybody here that has anything to bring before this board that is not on the agenda? Now would be the time to say something. Seeing no one, Carl, there's nobody online or on Zoom or anything that's here to speak at this particular moment?
We don't do that.
All right, so there's-
Nope, there's no, thank you.
All right, that will conclude that. There is no old business. Moving on, I was asked to take, I guess it's item number 8, item 8A specifically, to take and dispose of that early in the meeting, so we'll do that right now. And item 8A is a resolution honoring the outgoing student representative, who is Jeremy Bach, who is present with us today, sitting in our front row. And we have the following resolution, which I will read into the record. Whereas Jeremy Bach has served with distinction as a student representative of the Zoning Board of Appeals, leading and participating in consideration of cases essential to the improvement of this community, its neighborhoods, and the quality of life therein, and whereas Jeremy Bach was responsible for promoting and increasing community awareness of the need for sound residential and commercial planning and the need to appropriately design public and private improvements in Highland Park during his tenure as student representative on the Zoning Board of Appeals, and whereas, in being the institutional memory for the zoning board and in serving with honor, their public service attests to their steadfast integrity, wisdom, and excellence of character, be it hereby resolved that the members of the Zoning Board of Appeals of Highland Park do hereby recognize Jeremy Bach for their dedicated public service as student representative of the board on behalf of the residents of the city, and it is further resolved that as an expression of our respect and grateful appreciation to Jeremy Bach's service, we hereby adopt this resolution as a permanent record thereof on the 18th day of May, 2023, in Highland Park, Illinois. Congratulations and thank you, Jeremy. And this resolution will in fact be passed around and signed by everybody who's here tonight, and then the remaining people, I assume you'll obtain their signatures.
Chair, could I request a motion and a second and a vote on the resolution?
Oh, I'm sorry, you're right. We should officially pass this resolution to make you officially acknowledged, so
Doesn't he have to
I
give a
would.
speech first?
Yeah. If you'd like to say something, now would be the time. You're quite welcome. All right, and accordingly, I would at that point entertain a motion to approve this resolution.
I would 100% like to make that motion to approve the resolution.
Wonderful.
Member Beck will second.
That's a motion by Member Yablon to approve the resolution, seconded by Member Beck. Can we get a roll call vote, please, Carl?
Thank you, Chair. Member Trashansky.
Aye.
Member Beck.
Aye.
Member Yablon.
Aye.
Members Zaransky and Hendrick are both absent. Vice Chair Bay.
Aye.
Chair Colliper is absent. That motion passes 4-0. And I can, I know we don't have all the members to sign, but I can organize that collection between this meeting and the next meetings, and then reach out to you, Jeremy, when all the signatures are collected for collection of that, okay?
Jeremy's going to be a little red smudge on this because they gave me a pen that was defective, so I'm going to try it again.
It's really just blood.
Yeah, that's it. All right. Once again, we're all good. Thank you. All right, moving along, we have one item of new business, and it's number 2023-VAR-007. Property is known as 1126 Lincoln Avenue South. The appellant is Robert Schrago, and that is our one item. Carl, do you have a presentation for us, please?
Yes, thank you. Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Carl Burhup. I'm a senior planner with the Community Development Department, City of Highland Park. So this is a presentation for the application for 1126 Lincoln Avenue South for a zoning variation. This is the location of the property in the city, kind of in the east or southeast part, southeast of downtown. The project background is stated by the acting chair. The applicant is Robert Schrago. On behalf of the ownership, Andrew Schiller. The proposal, well, there's multiple proposals. It's a proposal for additions, but it's a second-story addition that is before the Zoning Board of Appeals. This property is in the R4 zoning district. It does not meet the minimum lot size. It's slightly substandard at about approximately 18,350 square feet. This is, the home was built in 1925, and that's according to the county assessor. And so this is an established building setback variation, EBS. EBS is the acronym I will use for that, and that's measured from these property line along the street. So this is an aerial of the property. I can come back to it again if there are more questions, but I'll just point out the lot is slightly irregular. The street is curvilinear. It is four-sided, but it's not, the angles are not perfectly squared. It's slightly undersized, as already stated. Then, of course, the property owner is working with an existing home that was built nearly coming up fast to 100 years old. And the existing home, as it sits, is non-conforming to the established building setback. Of course, there was no established building setback in the 1925 zoning ordinance. I believe the first zoning ordinance for Highland Park dates from 1922, just as an interesting side note. So this is a vertical addition, and so I have to be a little more careful on my slides when I discuss this. So on the left, you have the survey. The yellow indicates approximate footprint of the existing home. And on the right, the blue shade indicates what's proposed. But we have to be a little careful, though, because the proposed second-story addition, and this will be better, I think, indicated on my next slide, but this area right here, so this is the area that encroaches within the established building setback. It is a vertical addition, so it's not new footprint. It is within an existing footprint. Now, the area behind, some of that's new footprint, but that also meets the zoning code. That area is allowed. That's within the buildable area. And then, of course, I use the dashed line here to represent the established building setback, which is the average setback of the block. Okay, so this is kind of a zoom in on the applicant's site plan. And so I have a red arrow going to a dashed box. So again, this is the area that is before the Zoning Board of Appeals. This is a second floor addition that encroaches within the established building setback. The approximate area of that encroachment is 103.9 square feet. That's based on the numbers the applicant's design professional provided to me. It meets the front yard setback, meets the side yard setback requirements. So the front yard would be here, 40 feet in the zoning district, and then these are the side setbacks. So these are the elevation plans. So I indicated in blue shade the approximate improvement that needs relief. So this right here is the front elevation. So if you're walking on the sidewalk or the street and you look at the home, this is what you're looking at. So below indicates the existing, and you can see right now there's basically this balcony that is basically a second story or second floor balcony above an existing older part of the home. And so then, again, the applicant's intention or proposal is to construct an addition on top of that. This is a side elevation. This would be from the opposite side, so this doesn't really show the area that needs encroachment that well. Okay, then going to this slide. So the elevations here on the right side, so these are the south elevations. So the closest neighbor to this improvement, the neighbor to the south, this is approximately what they would see if this was to be constructed, as this faces south. So you have the existing again on the bottom here, shows how it's, I don't know if it's functionally used as a balcony or not, but that's the appearance or just how it looks. And then again, this is showing here that it's essentially closed in and becomes a second-story addition as proposed by the applicant. And I do want to point out on this, I shaded the whole thing blue. When I was putting this together, I realized that, only part of this is bisected by the established building setback. I would have the applicant indicate if they know specifically where. I just know based on the site plan, it's approximately it's approximately the midpoint of this improvement. But I just want to point that out to the board, so that established building line isn't dashed in here. But if you look at this, I shaded this whole thing blue, but in reality, only about approximately half of this is what needs the encroachment. So part of that area is within the buildable area, and part of it's not. So part of this front part is the area that's before the board that encroaches. And then the applicant did include floor plans. They're just indicating that's going to be a master closet. And then I'll note here that I believe this is a window location they have on here on the floor plan. On the elevation, they have a window matching that, but I'm not sure what this architectural feature is here. It doesn't appear to be a window, but the board could ask if the board was curious. Did ask the applicant to submit photos, because I know that was a point of discussion a few meetings ago. And so this is a photo, these are photos the applicant provided. So this is the home, this is the subject property. And again, this is the area, this is the existing footprint, and so this is for a vertical addition above that. Again, this is a picture of the home, the front elevation. Again, the proposal is for a second-story addition here on the left side. Then the applicant submitted 3 other photos, and these are the applicant's photos, so I'll have the applicant speak about that. I think the applicant was trying to identify homes within their approximate area that are similar and that have side additions on them. But again, this is an applicant exhibit. I'll let the applicant speak about that. This was submitted today, it wasn't in the packet, so I just put it in the presentation so it was easier for everyone to see. Okay, so established building setback is the driver of this variation. So on the right, we have an exhibit by the applicant that I snipped from their site plan. And so these are all the homes on the block, including the star, which is the subject property. And so the established building setback, it is the average setback, the average of the existing setbacks of all the properties on that block, excluding the subject property. And that's measured from the closest point of the front property line to the closest point of a building on the property. And I know this may be hard to read here, but it was in the packet, as well as in their plans. However, here, hopefully this is more legible, here I put all their numbers. So the setback numbers were provided by the applicant. These depth numbers I am providing from our GIS, so they should be considered approximate. The GIS can be off occasionally a few feet. And so here, I just want to note the order of these. So this here, the order, is not the order of the homes on the block. This order is from the highest to the lowest. And then it has the applicant here. And then the average setback for the applicant is 65.44 feet. And then I had some information in my memo on that. In the past, the board has asked, what happens if you drop the outliers? Or what if you do this or do that? So that analysis in the memo, of course, should be taken with a grain of salt. It was just an attempt to address that. If there are questions on that, I can answer those. Those are not in my presentation, but they were in my memo, and I can pull that up easily if I need to. I think in my memo, I considered the ones over 90. I think I dropped them as a group. And then I think I also did a calculation where I also dropped the smallest one. And then if you take the average of those, I think they'd still need relief, but it was like only by a foot.
Actually, I think in your memo, Carl, you referred to 4 lots with setbacks in excess of 90, and said if those 4 lots were removed, that would change the EBS to 52 feet.
Well, if that was true, if you only removed the ones in excess of 90, then yes, the applicant would comply. But then an argument can be made, why would you only drop the top 4? Why not also drop the bottom 1? So if you just drop the top 4, yes, the applicant's proposal would comply. But if you drop the top 4 and the outlier bottom 1, the 15.41, then I think it was like within a foot. I can refer to my memo, but it was much
You can
closer.
massage the numbers any way you want.
Correct.
Let's take
Correct.
3 properties contiguous to.
Correct. You're absolutely correct. That's why I get a little careful with this analysis, but it has been asked in the past, so I provided take it with a grain of salt. And this is just a different view, because I just want to make sure you try to have different views. I mean, it's a curvilinear street. It sits at an angle. And the depths for the properties are different. Forestry, no objections, and normally forestry doesn't if it's within the existing footprint. They're normally not going to have objections when it's within an existing footprint. The engineering division, no comments. There's no steep slope zone consideration or floodplain consideration. No written comments were submitted by the public. And then in terms of post-packet submissions, the only thing submitted post-packet were the photos by the applicant, and I included that in this presentation.
And for clarity's sake, Carl, when you said there were no written comments submitted, did you get any phone calls? Did anybody call about this?
Yes, yes. One or two neighbors immediately adjacent did call me, and of course, I alerted them as to, when the meeting was and provided them that information, and if they are here to speak, then they will speak.
Fair enough, thank you.
Oh, right, well, yeah, so what is the specific relief request? It was in the memo, but the specific relief request at maximum is 10.2 feet of requested encroachment into that required 65.44 feet established building setback. This is a zoning variation, so the board should use the 8 standards of approval from the zoning code, which I have a copy in front of each of you. Thank you. I can take questions. Thank you for your time.
Does anybody have any questions for staff? Seeing none, I guess we'll move on. I will ask if there's anybody here who would like to speak in favor of this application. I would ask that they identify themselves and approach the podium.
That would be the applicant, correct?
That would be, or anybody else, but.
Thanks.
I'm with Emily Schiller, owner.
All right, if you're both going to be speaking, yes, thank you. Identify yourself with your name and your address for the record, please.
Hi, I'm Emily Schiller, and I'm the co-owner of 1126 Lincoln Avenue South.
Okay. And you, sir?
Robert Schrago, 1171 Beach Lane, Highland Park.
Okay. I'd ask that you both raise your right hand. And do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. You may begin any order you want to proceed.
Okay, so I've been working with the Schillers for probably about 8 months on doing the design work for this home. So it does include, as Carl said, a first floor addition because the kitchen is small. A lot of the rooms are a little chopped up because, as Carol mentioned, it's somewhat on a slant. So it's not the true classic colonial where you see the quadrant. So there's a little bit of challenges trying to straighten it out, making a more ideal floor plan. However, they bought the house knowing this. They enjoy the house. They wanted to be, this is the area they wanted to be in, Ravinia, and Lincoln's just a great street, and so are the schools. So this was their passion to be here. They enjoy old homes, especially the one they bought. This is what they fell in love with. And they made some improvements before we came on board. And now they just want to finish and complete logical floor plans. It's good for them and good for the future and hopefully good for the neighbor as well. So we want to be fair about this. So we obviously know we have this FAR, and it's an obvious question, why can't you do something else? And we actually did try to do that, and we actually tried to just not even have the addition, period. So we went through a lot of permutations with the closet. So obviously pushing it back, it's just a small closet. You could say, well, people have small closets, but if you look on the blueprints, the whole first floor, there's like really tiny closets, which for that era wasn't unusual, but there wouldn't be any closet that wouldn't be, they're all small. So this one it's a logical size for a master bedroom. But also their passion is, they want it to look like Andrew submitted those photos for homes like that, and there's quite a few of them. So we've done similar additions where we'll build to the side. If there's dormers on the front, we'll usually pitch the roof up at a lower height, put a dormer in that too, continue the classic look so it's seamless. We didn't need to do that on this one, so keeping the roof low, actually, at least it helps with the daylight plane. I mean, I realize we have this addition on your side, and no one would say, yeah, I would love to have this. No one would, so we understand that. But the roof is flat, so at least we feel it's the best we could to minimize it. We did try, again, I was saying, is to do the design with the master bedroom, with the closet interior-wise. We just couldn't come up with anything that was actually the solution was worse than the problem. So we had size of the room to fit everything, but it wasn't really a logical plan. And then we even thought, well, why don't we just build up on the backyard? And then the house is just too big. We were landlocking a lot of the windows in the rear, so it really wasn't, it was a bigger design, but there's no logic, no fun having this, and no desire to stay there in this house to do that. So it kept coming around repeatedly that this really is our choice to make the closet logical. Now, on the side, you would mention, okay, there's one window, because they don't want to have windows, you don't want to see them, they don't want to see you, not that you're not friends, but it's privacy when you're upstairs. So there is one window there, we'll probably put a parasol blind in there to keep the light in the closet, but not so the neighbors could see each other. The other side was purely wainscoting. It's the design of the house below. So the one thing that Andrew and Emily they really wanted the upstairs to look identical to the downstairs, just like the pictures he was showing. So when we're done, you could assume there was an addition somewhere along the line, but we don't want you to be able to point out and say, this was just done, and that was done in another era. So we want this to look timeless and period to the house. Okay, we're good. I'll entertain any questions.
Does anyone have any questions for Mr. Srago?
Could you talk about the plan, what it will look like? Are those windows, doors, walls, dormers?
Oh,
Yeah.
perfect. Okay, so this is the side of the house facing, this is facing south, right here. So this is call it the fake window, it's really wood trim. This is the window, and this is approximately, let's just cut this in half and say this side is the encroachment, and this side, if we kept it within the setback, this is the size of the And I'm sorry, the full question again was?
Just,
Oh,
is
the
that,
roof line. This is to see, this is the roof of the existing house. This is the top of the roof of the proposed addition right here. So you're looking at the gutter.
okay,
Then this is the design, well, on this side, this is the window that matches here. And then on the front, can you see the front? This ties in, the up and the back is a match.
Everything
And
below
again,
is,
this looks like, I'm sorry to interrupt,
I'm sorry.
this line here looks like it's a roof. It's not. This is just a dimension line. But once again, this is the top of the roof. This is the top of the roof of the existing house.
Everything below the proposed addition is existing, and at least on the exterior, you're not planning on making any changes to that?
Nothing. So it starts from here, where, can't see.
You want me to pull up your original plan?
Oh, it's right here.
Okay.
Here's the original, and we're going from here straight up to here. So this railing comes off.
Okay. Any other questions for Mr. Srago?
Sure. So, it's a nice plan, and I like it, I understand why you want to do it, but for us to approve it, you have to go through the standards and find what's the hardship. So I really don't see the hardship, so can you address that?
Yeah, there's 8 hardships that,
The standards.
yeah. And I dropped my glasses. I'm looking at one eye here, so trying if it looks goofy. So the reasonable return, let's take the one extreme to the other. We could build it in the back, build this huge 2-story addition, and it buys them more room than they even want, and the cost would be substantial. And it's actually, design-wise, the return on investment, you wouldn't be able to sell the house. It would be good for them, And with the landlocked rooms, it really wouldn't be feasible, really even for them. We would want to move forward with something like that. Second hardship, sorry, can you? Yeah, the unique circumstances on this is established yard setback. The house was built before they knew there was going to be, excuse me, an established front yard setback. And to build a classic traditional style, this is what was established after the house was built. And the property in the back, it's big. So if we could move the house, we could scoot it over, we'd say it's fine. So we weren't starving for room on the property, but the hardship is that's the way the house was built then, and there was no zoning to say you can't do that, and no foreseen future that this could become an issue. So everyone on the block picked their own little place to build, and the lots are different, so that's kind of the necessity of why we're asking for this. We find that there was no other choice, and again, 8 months of trying not to do this, and we could not come up with something. I think we were clever enough because it was the architect, myself, the owners. We really spent a lot of time saying, let's go through everything that we can do, because we weren't hurrying them. We weren't trying to get the job going. And this is what we came up with. And it's a logical design that's been done, as Andrew showed you. It's very common in Highland Park to build out on that, build up from usually there's sunrooms below, then they become like a closet or an office space above.
All right, I think you've kind of addressed the next standard, which is also kind of a continuation of the hardship. I'll try and help you out due to your vision.
This dropped just when we were talking. They're shot.
And
I
those were
understand.
really the only ones that I was interested in.
That's right. Well, if you'd like to address the remaining, it's always good to address the remaining standards as well, so I'd be happy to
If
quickly
you
go
could help me,
through.
because I want to, you asked, and I want
All
to,
right, next standard is that the alleged hardship has not been created by any person presently having a proprietary interest in the subject property. I assume that's true, but
they're not here to flip the home. For one example, they're here to live in this house and continue.
they didn't create the conditions that are causing this to be required to get a variance.
Well, the conditions required is, it was built in a place where we had no choice. I think I'm answering that.
Okay, all right. The proposed variation will not be material detrimental to the public welfare or injurious to other properties or improvements in the neighborhood?
We're not going to, again, like with the daylight plane, we minimized it. So when you build, you're taking up some of that plane, but we went minimum on that. So injurious to a view, we've done the best we could to keep it a low profile. As far as we're not doing any vegetation that we're going to start planting on the owner's side and blocking them off. So there's no restrictions to the neighbor because the footprint is already there. And in the front, we're not coming out any further than the house is right now. So in the front, we're not blocking a drive-by view that was once there, that someone would say, well, now I miss it. Or we're not taking out trees and saying, it's injurious to my view. I used to like walking here. Now I don't see it. So we're just basically building up.
Next one, I think you alluded to earlier. The proposed variation will not impair an adequate supply of light and air to adjacent properties, substantially increase congestion in the public streets, increase the danger of fire, or endanger the public safety, or substantially diminish or impair property values in the neighborhood.
Well, people enjoy our design, and we did a good job. Hopefully it helps. But I'm not,
But what about the neighbors?
What about the adequate supply?
well, I know the neighbor wants to speak, so I don't want to, I'm not telling you what to think.
We're
or-
asking as the applicant to address this standard, if you would.
Yes.
As far as whether it would impair an adequate supply of light and air to adjacent properties.
Well, I don't want to say I believe that. I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Okay.
I'll be fair on this.
All right, we'll move on then. The proposed variation will not alter the essential character of the neighborhood?
It's traditional and it's proven design. I didn't come up with this. We're matching what's there and we're just continuing it.
All right, and lastly, the proposed variation is in harmony with the spirit and intent of the zoning code, to the extent that you know the spirit and the intent of the zoning code.
The spirit of this board, I've been doing, 24 years I've been coming here, and I've turned away. Half the people have asked me to do a variance. I said, no, it's not practical. It's not logical. I'm not doing it. You don't have a hardship. Then the other half, we've done it, where it's like, you know what, this is very fair. You're being genuine about this, such as them. And I feel going through here is the right thing to do for them, because it's not just for them, but we're really fixing a floor plan that's flawed. And it is. When the house gets bigger and you make it worse, you're not going to get that money out. You actually can make the value of the house less than what you bought it for by adding to it. And I'm sure we've all seen those, like, why did they do those? So, in this case, I think this is the right thing.
Okay. Any other questions for Mr. Schrago at this point? Seeing none, I know you were sworn. Ms. Schiller, do you have anything you'd like to add? If you do, you'd approach the microphone, please.
Just a couple comments since you all took the time to be here. Thanks for hearing the case. Just want to echo some of Bob's comments that my husband and I moved here almost 6 years ago. We love Highland Park. We're very active in the community. We've since grown our family. And, this is our forever home, this nearly 100-year-old home. And so we've really worked hard to continue to improve it to fit today's living standards to enjoy with our family for decades to come. And as Bob discussed, this is really the next step to improve the primary bedroom, closet, and bathroom to accommodate 2 adults living there. And honestly, the current structure has 2 windows facing our south neighbors. And in my opinion, since I'm the owner, an unappealing old fence, so to speak, or gate on that second floor. So I think the appeal that we're discussing here today will only beautify that space, will be in line with the tradition of this classic home, and will ultimately remove 1 window of that wall facing our south neighbor. That currently is our bedroom and now will become a closet. So I feel like privacy between, our neighbor will be even improved a little bit more. That's it. Thank you for taking the time.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody have any questions for the owner, for Ms. Schiller? Seeing none, thank you.
Yep.
Is there anybody else here who would like to be heard on this application? Okay. If you'd step up to the microphone and state your name and address for the record, please.
My name is Jill Rosenberg, and I live at 1114 Lincoln Avenue South, which is the property directly to the, I guess it's the south.
Okay. If I could swear you in, yes,
Oh,
raise your
sure.
right hand. Do you swear or affirm
Yes, I swear.
that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Thank you. You may proceed, please.
Okay. So I spoke with Ken? Carl. Earlier today, just because I know my husband has spoken with Andrew about the changes. So we're not concerned about the windows as much, the privacy issue as much as we are the light. That's one of the issues that we have. The other issue that we have is we have an existing electric utility pole against our garage, which is connected right now by cable and wires to the corner of their home, which I believe are going to be moved underground. And our concern is for the stability, once that happens, the stability of that pole, which we believe is the pole is on our property, so it's our ownership. And so if that cable that sort of provides resisting tension, I don't know what the correct building terms are for it, but it helps support that pole. If that's moved underground and the pole becomes less stable, that we will be in a position that either, our garage, which it sits against, will be exposed potentially, that we could lose power, or that we would have to incur the cost of moving those lines underground, or replacing the pole, or repairing it. So those are some of our concerns.
So if I understand correctly, you're concerned about the utility pole because your lines are going to remain on that pole?
Yes.
So the pole will have to stay there?
Yes.
And you're worried about it. Have you contacted anybody at the power company to ask what?
The power company said that, it would be our responsibility, because it's apparently our pole.
Did you ask the Schillers if they would make sure it's stabilized?
Well, I don't know what the conversations were about the electricity being moved underground, but I think that's the plan. So,
All right, if you're going to talk, I have to unfortunately ask you to come back up here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's all right. I'm sorry. We need to be able to hear you. So you're not planning on making any changes or affecting the wires of the, or moving the electric underground or
The
anything?
meter we have to move because it's undersized, so we're gonna put in, I think it's 100 amp, we're gonna go 200 amps. And it's an old meter, but, there was no plans to put it underground.
okay, so it will stay attached to I don't know, I guess
Yeah.
Abel had conversations with Andrew about that. So,
I'm sorry, it wasn't.
okay.
I can't visualize your issue, so I'm trying to understand. Our wires are,
So it goes from our pole to the corner of their home to provide electricity from there, but it's attached to our pole. So we're just concerned that we don't incur any,
so this is the pole in the rear yard? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay.
so,
It's the ComEd pole.
Right.
Maybe it was a telephone company at one point. So, yes, the wires, they own the pole. And there's a wire that goes to the Schiller's house, and then one goes to yours.
so the
So-
wires will remain, you're not
Oh,
gonna?
yeah, when we upgraded, ComEd is actually the one that takes it down and puts it back. So they can't leave a pole that's going to be unstable. That's
Okay.
something you and I can complain about, because
Okay.
if it affects you, it's gonna affect the Schillers too.
Right,
It'd
I
be a
just didn't
problem.
know how this all works, so.
May I make a comment, Chair?
Of course, go ahead.
I just would like to say one thing, because obviously I have no idea where this will go, what the zoning board will do. But just regarding these types of considerations, obviously they'll have to comply with whatever the relevant building codes are. So I just get concerned when there's a conversation like this. I don't want one party to walk away thinking that something will happen when it turns out there might be some type of code that requires a certain connection or a certain way. So in general, these types of utility connections or electrical connections or construction activity, that's something that will have to meet Highland Park electrical codes and codes related to that. And, if there are questions or concerns on that by either the applicant or neighboring property owners, I always encourage that to be directed through the building division and the building division manager. That's not to suggest that conversation can't occur here. I just get nervous because I don't want anyone to walk away thinking one thing is going to happen when it turns out a building code might require something else. So I just want to point that out.
Thank you, Carl. And to follow up on that, you would expect, Carl, that as part of the permitting process and then the subsequent inspections, that if an issue were to arise as to stability, the building department would be aware and address that?
Well, right, whatever construction occurs, the electrical, all of the construction has to comply with building codes. And again, I'm not suggesting that conversation can't happen here, I'm always careful, I don't want one party to walk away thinking something was said and then that will happen because, I don't know the electrical codes and the zoning board, obviously that's not the zoning board's purview, our electrical codes. And so I just want to be careful with that conversation.
Thank you.
That's not to suggest that can't, concerns, of course, can always be brought up and discussed.
Appreciate that. Thank you. anything else?
So that, then if that's the case and that isn't an actual concern, then the only other concern that we wanted to express was just that it will remove some of the light that we receive on that side of the house.
Does, how,
You're
do you know
to the
how?
south, to the south of the house?
Yes.
Can you explain how the light is going to be impacted by something that's to your north?
Just the concern that, it will feel darker on that side of the house and there won't be, as much space or as much air around the property anymore, especially with the addition of the additional back part of the house as well.
Well, the back part is not part of the relief that's.
No,
requested,
but
so
it'll
we're
be what eventually is there, so the entire,
approximately how far from your house is the closest part of their house?
that's a good question.
Does anybody know the answer to that?
Chair.
Yeah.
I actually checked to see if I could find a survey for the south property because I anticipated this question, but I could not find one on file. I'm sorry.
Do we even have a informed estimate as to how far it is?
We can use the GIS. I will pull it up now. Of course, that has to be considered approximate.
I did have the plans out, I guess I could have brought them, I didn't.
Oh, I clicked on the wrong one. Didn't have it preloaded, my apologies. Where- Okay, I'll use my laptop here. Sorry, I'll pull it up though, I'll get something. I have it right here. It is approximately, well, and you have to remember too, there's the neighbor to the south, I believe they have a driveway that runs in between the property line and their home. So the distance is, at least the width of that driveway. I mean, the GIS, which is very approximate, says.
We get that it's approximate, okay.
Says 21 feet from the neighbor's home to the shared property line. And then, of course, the applicant proposes, I believe, right at 12 feet. So that's an approximate distance of 33 feet wall to wall.
Okay, and the first floor is already existing, so
Correct.
it's not bringing anything closer, it's just extending
No,
up
extending
what
up
is,
the-
what is already there. Okay, all right. So, okay, any other questions for the witness at this point?
If,
Member Yedlin?
just to really bring in kind of the nuts and bolts of it, if they were to do what was allowed versus by right versus adding the additional however much space, I'm gonna call it from the chimney to the front, like since that's all we're talking about, whatever that amount is, how much do you feel that 5 feet, 8 feet,
10 feet.
10 feet, oh, thank you, 10 feet,
10
which
feet of
is,
variance.
it impacts your light and, because that's all we're talking about, is that small portion, not anything else.
Right, because you're saying the rest of it is not up for discussion.
Right, that's there,
Okay.
by right.
I mean, I don't know of a way to quantify it other than, just it's just a different proximity to the bedrooms up there than what's there now. And that just feels uncomfortable. I don't know how else to describe it.
I have a-
Other than the taking up of the space and the feeling like it's, it's closer to us, obviously, than it is now. That space is now closer to those bedrooms at that corner of our home, the way our home sits. It affects 2 bedrooms.
I have a question for, I think it's probably appropriately for Mr. Schrago. Of the addition that you're going to do, how much of that addition, Carl had mentioned this before, that we didn't have an exact dimension, as to how much of that is non-conforming and how much of that is within the established building setback?
10.2 feet or 10 feet 2 inches?
Oh, actually, that's right. That was provided. So, yeah, the encroachment, so the encroachment is 10.2 feet in depth. What's the best way to show this? Is it floor
And how
plan?
big is the addition
So
entirely?
on her side, 10 feet this way, and in the front, it's about 18 and a half feet.
Yeah.
I know she's not talking about the front, but just to get the perspective, if you're driving by, let's say it's 19 feet, so I'm not wrong, 19 feet wide, and on the neighbor's side, so I'm not wrong, 10 feet 4 inches, so I'll err on the side of caution.
Okay.
So on this, this floor plan the applicant provided, they give a total distance of the second floor addition as being 20 feet and just a little change over that, 20.1 feet. And so 10.2 feet is encroachment, so essentially exactly half of this area. And then by this, it's right there, it's a little over 9 feet. So that's how far it's coming out towards the neighbor. 9 feet, point some, 9 feet and several inches, 9 feet and an inch and 3/4 is what it says.
Okay, and obviously, it wouldn't be practical to do the addition, staying within the both from aesthetically and functionality, it wouldn't make sense to just build half the addition as opposed to the whole thing. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes, sir.
Any other questions? Anybody else have anything to say? No? Seeing none? Okay. Thank you for your presentation, your testimony.
Thank you.
At this point, we can get the opinions of the members of the board, and we will start with Member Beck. Completely arbitrary, but you're my right hand today.
Sorry, my apologies.
So, I mean, for me, I mean, it really comes down to, is there a hardship or not, or is this just an inconvenience? And I'm not convinced there's a hardship. So, and then the whole case hinges on that, and I'm willing to listen to what my colleagues have to say in that respect. But I'm leaning no, because I don't really think that there's a hardship.
Member Trushansky.
I understand what Member Beck's saying. But at the same time, I think there is a hardship in the sense of, you know, how the house was built and it is already non-conforming. So I think all the other standards are easily met, but I do struggle with that too. I'm obviously trying to find a way to get there. I think it's a good project. I understand what you're trying to do, and I would be inclined to vote for it.
Thank you. Member Yablon.
I see where it's a little bit sticky. However, in terms of weighing the hardship pros and cons, my knee-jerk would be to approve it, that by right, they're allowed, I'm just gonna call it half a closet, and they could do that without coming in front of us at all, and it would look terrible from an architectural standpoint, like walking by, you'd be like, why is there kind of a half roof and a wall? So I appreciate the aesthetics of what's going on here, and while I certainly would never want my neighbors to be closer to me than possible, and they're lovely people if they're watching, I understand that too. I also think that in looking at the property, and maybe we'd like to hear more about this, that in terms of like additions and what's being added, that why you wouldn't want to add a little bit more somewhere else, or what the problem is. I mean, I appreciate not using more land and having, less green space and things like that, there's already, for lack of better terms, a platform there that is easy and to build on and, is an economic, reasonable thing as well.
I think because the question's been raised, I would ask if Mr. Schrager wants to respond to what Member Yedlin said at this point. You can come back up to the microphone. We like doing that to you as many times. Next time you'll sit closer.
Councilor Minute Taker, take the minutes.
So again, if we just, as you had said, if we just cut the closet in half, part of it, remember, is a toilet closet, because the master bathroom is small, so it wouldn't be just a half a closet, be, that back portion is part toilet closet, a little bit of linen, and it'd be a smaller closet. It wouldn't be considered, and then I know you had another part, moving it back.
I'm sorry, what's a toilet closet?
Oh,
Does that mean there's a toilet in it? Does that mean it's a toilet off the
the
closet?
master bathroom is, well, here it is.
Let me go back to the floor plans, though, where it's maybe.
Glad you asked.
The small bathroom?
A WC in England.
Yeah, this is it. These are the proposed floor plans right here.
Right, okay,
You can
so
use the mouse if you-
this is basically, is this on the pointer? Can they see this?
Yeah, we did.
Okay, so this is basically the size of their existing master bathroom right now. So we're expanding it to have a toilet closet, give it some more room. And then we took whatever's left over for a linen closet. So if we cut this in half, if you look at the fingertips, this would be about right here, the closet, with the linen here. If we did that, and if we slid it back, it's somewhat training the same thing. We're still talking daylight plane, and we're shifting the same box, but we're shifting it over. And then the floor plan gets illogical because now it's out here.
You mentioned
So-
something about that creating like a landlocked room if you did something differently. Did I hear correctly?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say to the point where you could have, maybe you could have thought about that. We try to think of everything, even build, like I said before, even building out on the back, because we have a flat roof there, and then there would be a taller structure there. Even if we dormered it, it would be such a small box. There's nothing logical or classic about it. And then the floor plan of the master bedroom, we've tried every permutation, shifting it back here to get, this would be the addition, and then all the way here is where we'd be putting it on top of the other addition that we're building, which also has a flat roof. So-
Answer your questions.
And I think you had one more part of the question. I think it was sliding it back.
Correct, and then can you talk about more so why that's not doable? Not necessarily why it's not as good, but why it's not doable, or what's that part of it, sorry.
Right, the floor plans, even though we create more size, we couldn't create a good logical floor plan that made sense. And then the other thing was, landlocking other windows in the house. And also, for the outside, let's face it, it's an illogical floor plan. It's gonna look pretty funky to look from the back pool house and the pool to this structure that looks like it wasn't meant to be. And I know you could get creative in architecture, but we couldn't. We couldn't come up with anything that said, this should be here, that's kind of cool. It's coming out. It's not like it's a dormer somewhere that someone put in there to get more light. It has to be a tall structure to get the required headroom. So if there was anything that we could come up with, and we tried. We put a lot of time into this, and the clients were great to work with, so everyone was receptive. The architect was great. We tried every design we could, including not even building the addition on the second floor, because we had the room, but it made everything illogical. So we definitely tried this, and the architect is great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else you'd want to say after this, or no?
No,
Okay. All right, thank you. Yeah, I tend to agree more with my colleagues to my left, although give Member Yablon, or I'm sorry, Member Beck a chance to speak again. I think the hardship is trying to keep everything in line with what is already there, and doing something that makes sense and doing something that's functional. And so, I respect what Mr. Schrago said about he wouldn't be here if he thought there was some other appropriate way of proceeding where we wouldn't need the variance. So I think that speaks to the fact that this is really the only method of dealing with this and accomplishing an addition to this house in a manner that makes sense. And I would therefore think that the standards have been met, and I would be in favor of the variance. Before we move on, I'll ask if Member Beck has been persuaded one way or the other.
Well, I think what Member Yablon said probably holds the most water, in that if they built it by rights, it would look pretty not consistent with the neighborhood or the architecture. So I will change my leaning to the other direction to join my colleagues.
Okay. At this point, I will speak to the applicant and tell you that it requires, since there's only 4 of us tonight, it requires a unanimous vote in order for the variance to be approved. You have some idea as to how the board is leaning. You also have the right to ask for a continuance and wait until there's either 5, 6, or 7 members of the board as opposed to just the 4 of us. If we do proceed and take a vote tonight, the vote is final. And it's really the decision, it's up to you whether you would like for us to proceed with a vote or whether you'd like to continue the matter.
Go Chair, if I may make one comment.
And staff would like to make a comment as well.
Of course, it depends on what motion is made, but if a motion to approve does not pass, that does not deny the application. The application is still ripe for additional motions, such as a different type of motion for approval with conditions or a motion to continue to another date.
Okay, thank you, Carl. I assume you followed what staff said.
No, sorry. So I think I should probably make it clear that I will vote in favor of this to go with my colleagues. So I hope that makes it easier for you to decide what you want to do.
Okay.
Thank you. We're going to proceed, please.
All right, so in, well, I think we're good at this point. So, all right, at this point, I would entertain a motion.
I would like to make a motion to approve the order as drafted.
Any second?
I'll second it. Member Beck seconds.
All right, we have a motion by Member Yablon to approve the request for variation using the approval order as drafted, seconded by Member Beck. Carl, can we get a roll call, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Member Trashansky,
Aye.
Member Beck,
Aye.
Member Yablon,
Aye.
Member Zaransky and Member Hendrick are absent. Vice Chair Bay
Aye.
and Chair Collier is absent, so that motion passes. The order is adopted by vote 4-0.
Okay, thank you. Congratulations. Carl, I don't know what the procedure is now. Am I going to be signing the approval order tonight, or do we wait for the,
You would sign it, sir. You can just cross out cross out the chair's name and just write.
I've always wanted to do that. Okay.
All the other information in there, of course, is accurate and was in the packet. That would be the only change that's being made is the name, that signature.
Okay. Fair enough. All right. Moving on, next item on the agenda is staff report. Do we in fact have a staff report, Carl?
I will just state that there should be one new application on June 1st and one new application on June 15th. And then I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I'm a little excited. I think we'll have a new planner 2 to train who will hopefully be able to attend the June 1st meetings. Of course, I won't be going away anytime soon. You got to go through a few of these to really learn the ropes.
We will be happy to have you as long as you can be
Yeah,
here.
I won't be going.
So, and for the record, I'd like to apologize to our student representative, who I completely ignored.
that's all right.
Didn't give you a chance to weigh in, but, all right. Miscellaneous, we've already honored the outgoing student representative, which is, and we're then going to proceed, are we adjourning the zoning board before doing legal training?
Nope, this is part of this meeting.
So legal training stays being recorded and part of the meeting?
Yes, and in fact, I think our Vic Walter, the audiovisual guy, I think he was even gonna make a big thing to make the recording extra easy to access for those members not attending, so.
Okay, fair enough. In that case, I will turn over the floor to Mr. Hart Passman and his associate for our legal training portion of our program tonight.
Am I driving here? So, hi, everyone. Mark's gonna sit, you gonna join me up here?
It's a good
I don't know
time.
if there's enough room up there.
All right, well, okay, well, whatever you. I'm gonna take off. I haven't even got started yet.
That's why he's taking off.
You're very captivating, Hart.
I guess not. Understood.
Always good to see you.
When you're on the council, you hear too much from us, so I understand.
You like making an exit, that's it.
Well, it's nice to be
Any
back. Hi,
update on our
everyone.
change, are we gonna change your liaisons this year?
Well, there's always musical chairs on liaisons. Now, what the final seating will be, we don't know.
Have you requested to stay with us?
Or the opposite,
Such a
perhaps?
politically polite answer. No, there's always a shuffling.
I'll answer for you. You'll go where needed.
I'll go where I need to, right, I can serve best.
You serve at the pleasure.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So, good seeing you. See you around. Okay, bye.
You know, he looks just like he does on Zoom.
So we're back in person. Last time we did this, it was right around this time of year, we were on Zoom, so it's good to see you all in person. Hart Passman, my colleague Marcus Martinez is with me. You will recall Marcus helped me do the training last year. Marcus is staffing the Plan and Design Commission, and so he's been involved since, Marcus, we've been a firm about a year and a half now?
It feels shorter, but yeah.
Yes, thank you. I love that answer. But Marcus has been working on a lot of the zoning matters for the city, and so just assisting with all sorts of things, working with the Community Development Department. And so the two of us are pleased to be back for the annual legal training, I guess the Corporation Council Workshop. As I think you all know, the City Council has asked that we provide this training to a few select commissions, not because anyone's done anything wrong, not because there's any problems, but really, I think to respect the gravity and the seriousness of the work that you do. So we do this annually for the Planning Commission, Zoning Board, Housing Commission, and Historic Preservation Commission, which is not to denigrate the other city boards and commissions, but really a lot of property rights come into play, as you well know, before those four commissions. And so we come to you every year. The good news, I think, is that there's really no major changes in the law, not in Illinois or in the city of Highland Park, no major issues or problems that we've had to grapple with at the zoning board or elsewhere in zoning at the city. So this is largely the same presentation. This is really a chance to have a refresher. We actually find it helps us, and I hope that you find it useful as well. We'll try not to dwell too much on the things that I know that you know, but I hope we can take this opportunity to kind of, again, refresh ourselves about some of the key laws and provisions of our city code and state law that control what you do here. So, press the button, nothing happens.
You know, it did beep at me towards the end of my presentation.
There we go, okay. So what we'll talk about real quick, we'll talk about the overview of legal authority for the ZBA, go through variations, which I know you know well. We'll talk a little about appeals, which you don't do very often, but it's sitting out there in your name and part of your jurisdiction. General procedures for how your meetings should be conducted. Briefly on sunshine laws, Freedom of Information Act and Open Meetings Act, and then finally a review of the city's ethics guidelines. We'll start with the core of why you're here and how we're here. The Illinois Zoning Enabling Law, that's part of the Illinois Municipal Code, which is the general statute that controls everything municipalities do in this state. I'm not going to read that whole quote, but this is the general purpose. This is the authority that we have to regulate on zoning. This is the very first provision. The law specifically allows us to regulate a variety of things about land use, and I've identified some of the more common ones that we deal with. Certainly height and bulk of buildings, that's most commonly coming before you here. Setbacks also relates to bulk. Uses, permitted and special, that typically is a plan commission item, but it's part of the same zoning statute. Affordable housing is expressly called out in our statute, and exterior design, which under the city's rubric falls under the PDC's purview. Statute also says that the the city may provide for the appointment of a Board of Appeals, and indeed, that's who you are. You can see here, I've highlighted some of the key what I think are the key provisions of this part of the statute. It allows us to vary the regulations in accordance with general and specific rules relating to the use, construction, or alteration of buildings or structures or the use of land. So we have pretty broad authority. We can set the rules for zoning, and then we can set rules for how we vary zoning, because as you well know, zoning codes are not really workable when they become one size fits all. It just, and Highland Park, in its own way, every community has its reasons why, but land is developed differently at different times. There's different natural features. Certainly a community like Highland Park with its ravines and some of its topographical changes, you just can't plunk a code down everywhere and have it work for everything. And the statute recognizes that.
So as Hart pointed out, the enabling statute allows the city to establish a Board of Appeals. That's exactly what it did here. The city council created the zoning Board of Appeals. The statute did not require it. The Board of Appeals, the zoning Board of Appeals, is comprised of 7 voting members. It's comprised of 1 non-voting city council liaison, and it's comprised of 1 non-voting student representative. Your jurisdiction includes hearing applications for certain variations. It includes hearing and deciding on appeals from the decision of the zoning administrator, and you can hear and make other recommendations as directed by the city council.
Marcus mentioned, and I believe you know this, but it's worth mentioning again, you have a final authority over certain kinds of variations. And Highland Park is very unique in this regard. In most communities, and almost everyone around here has some kind of a zoning board, or it's all part of a joint zoning and plan commission. Either they have a zoning board that says, here you can do everything, just take care of it, or it said you can recommend on anything, and it comes up to the city council or village board. We've got a hybrid, and reflected in our Compeer rule. You only have final authority over those specific variations that are mentioned in our zoning code. Beyond that, we have the very unique Compeer rule, and Thomas Compeer, he's got a plaque out here and a stone out on the walkway to Hazel. He was a corporation counsel for decades, I think in the 50s into the late 80s or even 1990. And I believe it was his invention, this idea that for anything that's not in those designated enumerated variations, there might still be a way to get it varied, but you got to go to the council first. And the council can decide, do we want to send this to ZBA and have them adjudicate it finally? Send it to the ZBA for hearing, but send it back up? Or we don't want to hear this, it's dead right here. That's the Compeer rule. So you do get referrals back from the council, and depending on how they refer it, you might be the final decision maker, you might be just a recommending body in that regard. You do have final authority over appeals as well. Yes, member back.
In the previous slide, there was something about a zoning administrator.
Yes.
Who is that?
That is Joel Fontaine.
Oh, okay.
I'm glad you asked it. We're going to talk about appeals in a little bit. I love appeals, although I hope we don't get one because they can be clunky, but the core of your name in some ways is when the zoning administrator makes a decision that someone thinks was wrongfully interpreted, and they can come to you as the final decision maker to adjudicate whether the zoning administrator, in our case it's the director of community development, read the code right or wrong. I think the last one we had, it's been a few years now, Carl, you may remember, it was the, was it the fence up on Sheridan Road?
575 Euclid, the fence on Euclid.
It was on Euclid, right. There was a gentleman who, what's that?
Oh, sorry, when you said Sheridan Horse, it wasn't me.
So the zoning administrator makes a decision if something has to come to the zoning board?
No, so that, here's an example. There was a property up north, on, I think it was an address on Euclid, and the backyard actually fronted on, I think it was on Sheridan.
Well, it was, I believe it's Western Avenue, but it wasn't constructed or improved, but the
Right.
right-of-way.
There was a right-of-way that was opposite the front, and because it was abutting a right-of-way, the zoning administrator ruled, and I forget the details, that there were certain limitations on the fence that could be constructed. The property owner disputed that interpretation because the right-of-way hadn't been improved, and under our code, and there's statutory authority that underlies this, he could bring an appeal saying, I don't think the zoning administrator read the zoning code right. You sit as an appellate body in that regard. for those of you that pretend to be lawyers like me. Was that out loud? But so it's a rare thing. We've had I've been working with the city for 18 years almost, and I think we've had 2 or 3 appeals in all my time. They don't happen very often, but there is a mechanism if someone disputes how staff is interpreting the code to bring it to you for your determination.
And theoretically, that can work in either instance where the zoning administrator has believed that something is in compliance with the zoning code and would grant a permit, or if he was to decide not to, and it could be appealed either way, I would.
Exactly, yeah, it could be.
Made by an interested party, not the applicant.
Yeah.
Right, that's right. There is a notion of someone who is aggrieved by a decision can appeal that. So it'll come at some point, and we'll never know when, but it is part of your authority. When you have final authority, the next step for an applicant that doesn't like what you've done is to take it to the circuit court on administrative review. And the review by the court is strictly on the record created at the zoning board. There's no new evidence presented on administrative review before circuit court. Now, for the things that you have only a recommending role for, and that would be for you only the compeer referrals where the council says send it back up. Those, if someone doesn't like the council's action, that gets sent up to the court on what's called de novo review. And that's a Latin term, basically means new review. In a de novo review of a council decision, it's a clean slate. Either side can bring whatever evidence that they want. I mentioned this to emphasize the importance of the record of the Zoning Board of Appeals, because when you have final authority, which is most of what you do, what you say and do here is the only thing a court's going to see. That's why these are recorded. That's why we insist on having evidence in advance. All those things are because of the importance of the process right here for parties' judicial rights.
And, Hart, on that, one thing I really liked that you all did earlier was you went through the standards one by one with the applicant's representative, and you addressed each one. I really like that. Not all communities do that. Anyway, this is the, next one.
Yep, I came back.
This is the language in the zoning enabling statute, and you'll see we have highlighted there practical difficulties or particular hardship. This is what is required, as you know, in order to allow a variation from zoning regulations. You'll see this language again. It's in section 150-1201 of our zoning ordinance, and again, you see practical difficulties or particular hardship. Variations can be granted, as you know, when you've made a finding that the practical difficulties or particular hardships exist if there is a strict enforcement of the zoning ordinance.
So that reminds me of our big discussion about practical versus practical.
Yeah.
Yeah, so now we're going to get into the standards. Because what Marcus highlighted, and it was important to see how the city code parrots the statute. That's the core of when a variation is justified. We have then standards that underlie that determine whether or not those 2 standards have been met. And these come in some ways out of some case law in Illinois. They're commonly found in zoning codes throughout the state. But they are kind of, it all kind of goes together, all flows together.
Is that true also, Hart, of the fact that we have different sets of standards for fence cases, heritage trees cases, and then just normal zoning variation type cases?
For all of those, your decision-making is final, and so I think we're talking really on the kind of your core variations or zoning variations. This doesn't strictly apply to heritage trees or fences. Those are different parts of the code. Excuse me.
Because that's where the practical versus practicable.
Yeah.
In the heritage.
So the reason why those were given to the zoning board is, and Carl can speak to this. I think, Carl, you may have been were you part of these amendments? Maybe, I can't remember if you were part of that or not. But the idea was the council wanted consideration of those items to kind of go along with the rest of development on a lot. And the idea being, why are you removing a tree? Well, we're removing a tree because we have to put the house here. Well, what if we give you a setback there? You don't have to remove the tree. Those were the kind of analyses there. So some of the practical and practicable come into play there. These are very much, as you know, case specific, right? It's very hard to put in this is what practical means. We don't really know that till we get into the weeds of it. And I agree with Marcus. I think your practice of going through the standards and trying to apply them to each property is a very solid one. And not only is it great for creating the record, which is the point Marcus made earlier, but it's just a good discipline to have in understanding what this means. And I will tell you, I've been coming to the zoning board for a long time, and I think throughout that history, the zoning board's done a good job, but it took some time when the zoning board started stressing that standard by standard review. And prior to that, it was sometimes a little fuzzy how these would be applied. I think you're doing a more consistent job of it, so I applaud you for that. Number one, this is a tricky one, and we can talk about these as we go along. We can talk about them at the end. But number one is standard in our code, cannot yield a reasonable return under the general zoning regulations. That's debatable what that means, and we can talk about that. I'll give you an example a little later of what I think it doesn't mean. But there is a notion that someone, and it's not as though someone is doing this so that they can then sell the property. That's not the idea. But is a property not going to achieve a reasonable value? Reasonable, whether that's monetarily or use-wise, if the variation isn't granted. Right? That may be related to size, location. It could be a variety of reasons why that's the case. The plight of the petitioner is due to unique circumstances, and the variation will alleviate some demonstrable and unusual hardship. The keys here is that this shouldn't be something that's common throughout the city. The idea, again, is that the zoning code is on its face a reasonable law for the city. But there's something about this lot, not something that every property has. And I struggle with a good example all the time. Oh gosh, we really could use a fifth story here. Well, so could everybody, right? That's not unique to you. I don't know why you want a house that big. That's not for me to say. It's got to be, there's a problem here that, and one of the common ones might be, a setback from a ravine or height because of topographical issue. We can't achieve the norm here because there's something weird about this property or weird about its location.
So is not having a two-car garage a hardship now?
That is a classic example, and it's a difficult one.
Right.
That fits into a few of these.
Right. but
Right.
We say, well, that's the de facto standard, of the age, not when they built the house, but we have a lot of cases that come before us about that.
That is the conundrum that we struggle with throughout the North Shore, the northwest suburbs, and it's people have an expectation. Is it a reasonable return to have a one-car garage for the investment people are making in Highland Park? I don't know. I think some people will say,
Well, that's a use.
it's a use, right, some people will say, no, it's not reasonable. Everybody here drives. Some would say you bought the house with one car. Right.
What would definitively resolve that issue? Would it be a court decision that would have to be made in order?
Yeah, I don't know that you can ever have it would have to be such a unique, I hope it's not a court decision. I don't want to be in that fight. But
What about precedent to the board?
so that's a good, precedent, and we'll probably come back around to this a few times. You're not really setting precedent on each case, especially if you do the job that you're doing of going through the standards each time for each property. Legally, what you rule on one case is not precedential for another. Practically, would it be persuasive to a judge? It might be. Keep in mind also, as I mentioned, it's administrative review. So you might have granted relief to 123 Main Street, and then the next week you get, 42 Poplar, and you say no, and they say, I can't believe this. You granted it last time. Is that in the record for 42 Poplar, what we did on Main Street? If it's not, the judge isn't supposed to consider it. Do I recommend you be consistent? Yeah, of course. But every property is different. And if you're doing your standard by standard review, you'll find those distinctions. And I've heard you discuss this. That, well, remember that old one we had? Well, that was, we granted it then because it had those things that this one before us today doesn't. That's great analysis. That shows that you're doing the case-by-case application of the standards that you're supposed to. To answer your question, Member Beck, I don't know. I don't know. Do you need a second car? Do you need a third car garage? Some would argue you need three. You have to take it on a case-by-case basis.
And if I'm hearing what you're saying correctly, there's really no end in sight to the conundrum. It's likely to go on indefinitely, and we'll just have to decide individually.
I think that's right. I would hesitate to say this is how you should rule on that particular issue. I just don't think we can do that. Yeah, Alexis?
Under unique circumstances, just because I've seen this off and on in the last 2 years, I live on a corner lot. Like, to me, a corner lot, there's two on every block. How unique is that?
That's a fair question. I think.
To which there's no answer.
I think that's a fair question. I'm not suggesting that therefore it's not unique, but what's.
Well, there was discussion, I think maybe Carl brought it up, that they're talking about changing that rule, that if you're on a corner lot, you don't have two front yard setbacks that they're gonna make one aside.
That would be a common sense amendment to the zoning code if they were, inclined, if the council was inclined to do that.
Carl,
but,
did you
yeah.
mention that, or?
Well, there was, in 2020 or 2021, the city did make, I call it was like a multi-front text amendment. And it was for through lots, peninsula lots, which peninsula lot's not actually a code term, but it's three-sided. It's a multi-corner lot, and then corner lots, so it's, yeah, multi-front. But it was oriented towards sports courts, porches, decks, a few other more accessory-type improvements. And the idea is that, hopefully over the next few years, that it will reduce those type of, formerly common requests that the board saw. But it doesn't get to additions or homes, though. And the reasoning behind that was, those are bigger structures, and the thinking was is that those types of things should still come before a board. But the more smaller accessory nature stuff, it was a granting of additional rights for multi-frontage properties.
Thanks.
This kind of gets to your question, Alexis. Is the hardship differently not generally applicable to other properties in the same zoning district? That's in our code. Again, so I don't want to it's got to be something unique about this property that other properties don't have to face. Doesn't mean that there's no other property that faces it, but it just can't be a general thing that we have to deal with as property owners. This is a key one to me, and this is really a couple things. The first part I think is most important. The hardship has to be related to the physical nature of the property. It's not about the person. And the reason for that is, I think, fairly obvious. You grant a variation for building, that building's going to last beyond the people, we hope, last beyond the people that built it. So it can't be, this variation is for this applicant because there's something about that person that is a hardship. And we'll talk a little bit about a tricky example when it comes to physical disabilities. That's a different area of law. It's about the property. What is different? What's the hardship caused by the property? And we again see the idea that this is not a matter of just an inconvenience. It's got to be something significant, getting back to that reasonable return issue. Standard 4, similar, not self-created by the current owner. Right? This is something that the owner came to, not that they caused. Standard 5, we start to get into the impacts on others. It can't be detrimental to the public welfare and or surrounding properties and area. So it may be that the owner says, I got a problem with the reasonable return. I need setback relief, or I need height relief. May be that they show on one hand that they have a unique hardship related to the property. But you can only go so far as to what won't hurt the neighborhood. And if there's no way to balance that out, that if there's an undue detriment to the rest of the neighborhood as a result, the zoning code dictates you shouldn't grant it. The idea behind this is you get just enough to get over that hardship and just enough to get to that reasonable return. The fact that it's not like the nose under the tent and you get everything you want. We're not building Sears Towers in the middle of residential neighborhoods because you have a height problem. Kind of elaborates some of that same point, but specifically, the variation cannot impair adequate light and air or increase public street congestion, risk of fire, or diminish property values. That last one's what you often hear from objectors. It's going to diminish my property value. I leave it to you to decide what kind of evidence you need for that. We'll talk a little bit more about whose job it is to prove the case. Number 7, similar, will not alter essential neighborhood character. And finally, number 8, the variance has to be in harmony with the spirit and intent of the zoning code. Flowery language, what exactly does it mean? It's, again, a case-by-case thing. But it all gets to this general point. Someone's got a hardship, fine. They don't get to do everything they want to. They've got to still manage the impact on the neighborhood. And we've got to be able to walk out of this room saying, we didn't just do something that completely upended our zoning scheme. We're going to give a little relief as necessary to allow these folks to use their land the way that we think it should be. That's the standards are all about. Must meet all 8 standards. Our code is not written in the disjunctive, it's in the conjunctive.
So who shoulders the burden of proving that the standards have all been met as to an application? As you were mentioning, is a corner lot a unique circumstance? Who has to show you, for instance, that a 2-car garage is necessary in order to achieve a reasonable return on the property? Is it Carl over here as he gives his presentation? Is it the applicant? Is it on the objectors to disprove that the standards have been met? Or is it on you, the ZBA, to show and prove that the standards have been met?
I wasn't told there'd be a test.
This
You get to keep your seats, it's okay.
I think it's the applicant.
I think, yeah, clearly, I agree with Member Beck. I think clearly it's the applicant's burden to bear.
All right, anybody disagree there?
I skipped ahead, I showed them, they're right.
They are right. It is
I
on the
didn't,
applicant.
I didn't notice that, did you?
That's the extent of our technological capability right there.
Yeah, that was an animation. It got bigger. You missed it. But
Let's
They were
replay
filling in A.
it. Yeah,
Oh, contextual clues, I like it.
red herring.
so staff here, they're here to provide background on an application, but ultimately it is the applicant who has to prove that each and every one of these standards has been met before you approve the application.
All right, so we talked a little about around these, let's talk about it. The case of the greedy applicant, right? These are common problems. As I mentioned, you may have a problem as an owner of property with getting a reasonable return. But the code says that's to be distinguished between a desire to make more money. Again, it's a little hard to know when someone's on which side of that line, but it comes back to the point I made just a few moments ago. If there's a hardship, fine, you get what you need to ameliorate that and no further. The case of the unique applicant, we talked about this a little bit already. Self-created hardships I mentioned are not part of our standards. Mention the Fair Housing Act here, and this, I mentioned someone who is physically disabled. That is a separate area of law, and it's something that we work with staff to try to steer folks away from the variation process for two reasons, and they worked side by side. One is that, as we mentioned, the variations are not supposed to be for the person. So you can imagine, the classic example I give is you've got a home, you've got a front yard setback, and someone is in a wheelchair. They need a ramp to get up. Well, what if there's not enough space to build the ramp except to go into the required setback? Is that a problem with the property? No, it's a problem the person has. If they come in for variation, if we apply the standards strictly, they should be denied. However, the Fair Housing Act says, and you may know this, we can't discriminate in the provision or availability of housing to those with disabilities. Disabilities, of course, includes physical disabilities. It also includes mental, behavioral disabilities. Even recovering drug addicts is a recognized disability under the Fair Housing Act. So the answer when you've got someone that has some physical or medical condition that requires some relief is we take them through a totally separate process. It should never come here. It's not a variation. We have a statutory obligation under federal law and under comparable state laws to provide reasonable accommodations to people who are disabled and who need something, in my example, like the ramp. And that's something that's worked out at the staff level.
So we had a case last year, the family that had a girl who needed a therapy pool. And I think they were here twice because she had a disability. So why did that end up? I mean, should we have just said, this really isn't our jurisdiction, we should be going a different route?
I think that's a good question we should work on with staff. I don't know that I was familiar with that one, candidly.
Carl, do you remember that case?
Well, what I will say is this, is that Planner 2 Kelsey Faywell did work with our corporation council.
Oh, is it that one?
I don't
With the-
believe it was that one. I think I know the one you're talking about, but all I'm gonna say is that Planner 2 Kelsey Faywell did work with our corporation council on setting up a more rigorous staff administrative process to make sure that things that should fall under a Fair Housing Act are gonna go that route. That's all I have.
So let's say
Okay.
a case slips through the cracks and it gets here.
It happens.
Should we just say stop, that we shouldn't hear this case?
Well, I think they have a right to file the application. But I think if it's something that we can all keep a closer eye on, if it's something that looks like this is about the person and a physical disability, it may be that, 'cause honestly, it's a lot of work for them to do, right? To come in here to prove up their case. It may be that they're entitled under the Fair Housing Act.
So who is the determining body that would say, well, despite the zoning code, the Fair Housing Act is going to control and should override the zoning code?
It's going to be zoning administrator, Joel Fontaine.
So that might end up before us anyway, because they would appeal it if they,
Someone in theory could, yeah.
yeah.
And just as a heads up, we're seeing, I think, more aging parents
Yeah.
issues. Like
Yeah, we
that,
do hear
you know,
that.
we'd like an addition because my parents are eventually gonna live here and they need to be on the first floor.
Yeah, we're also hearing a lot, and I'm wondering how much we're allowed to take into consideration the changes in societal norms, meaning people who come in and say, I'm working remote now. I mean, at the time there was COVID,
Yeah.
and now even, I think studies have shown that a lot of people who are working remote are going to remain working remote, does that create a hardship that they need an office?
And my question there, I don't know the answer to that one. I don't know that I would say reflexively, well, if it's just about the parents aging, therefore it's not valid. Because it may be that becomes a, quote, reasonable return as society does change, as you mentioned, Vice Chair Bay. So I think these are things that we're going to have to analyze.
Is aging a disability?
No, in and of itself, no.
Okay.
But if they were to say, my father who's in a wheelchair is going
Right,
to move
that's a
in.
disability, right?
That's right. So that they may be entitled to something under the Fair Housing Act, and it should, if it's shudder to say, if it's that clear, it shouldn't need to go through a variation process.
So aging per se is not a disability, but aging-related disabilities may in
It might.
fact qualify.
It might, yeah.
So we should be fairly liberal, that if somebody came in with an egregious ask for say, I have a disability and I want a, 40-foot encroachment into the front yard.
But now, you're right, now.
We should say, wait a minute.
I can give a whole different presentation, Marcus and I have dealt with this in a variety of capacities, on how you deal with reasonable accommodation of the Fair Housing Act. Suffice to say, for now, it's a similar concept. You don't get to completely upend the zoning code. I have a disability, therefore I get to build the Taj Mahal of ramps. It doesn't work that way. You get what you need, it's the same idea. But the key is that someone who is a personal issue, if it relates to a disability, probably doesn't need to come a variation in the first place, should be handled at the staff level. Because under federal law, we'd have to give it to them, right? Why put them through a process that we have to say yes to or risk legal liability? I'd rather not get into that.
As a practical matter, the mechanism for us using the Fair Housing Act to say, would that be to say that creates a hardship? Because we're aware of the, we haven't really even been required or presented with a copy of the Fair Housing Act to read.
Yeah, I would say, I would like to keep those out. The hardship has to be about the properties. The best case scenario, and there's gonna be something gonna slip through the cracks, because it's sometimes difficult, the best case scenario is if it's something that someone's asking for, because they're saying, I have a disability, and therefore I need X, let's evaluate that under a Fair Housing Act rubric and not under the variation. That's the best way to do it. The last thing I want to say about this unique applicant, and we alluded to this a little bit, amendments. Sometimes we see something that's maybe personal or something about an applicant that doesn't meet the physical property standard. Maybe there's a good thing here. Amendments can fix the code sometimes. Maybe the corner lot issue is one where, well, you're not unique, but we maybe should change the setbacks. And Carl talked a little about some of those efforts recently. The case of the really, really, really good idea, but it's just not allowed. The variation has to satisfy all 8 standards. So someone comes forward, I want to do this for my property. Wow, well, that's cool. But you don't meet the standards. We're not supposed to grant it in that case. So I mentioned the term functional obsolescence. This is one that some communities are struggling with. Some communities have written this into their zoning code. We vetted this with the city many years ago, and the city said we didn't want to add this. And this maybe gets to the garage idea. Is a property functionally obsolete because it doesn't have certain features? Is that a reason that we would say it doesn't have a reasonable return? Again, there's no one-size-fits-all answer to that, but the notion of functional obsolescence is not in our zoning code. It's not a standard. You got the 8 standards, we went over them, that's what you're looking for. If that's really a problem, we can go back to the amendment route and figure it out from there. We talked about this a little bit very quickly. We know about appeals. Someone who's aggrieved can file that within 45 days. It's a public hearing. There are no specific standards for appeals because you're sitting as judges, really. You will be given the zoning code provisions in question. The appellant will give their argument. Director Fontaine, in this case, would give his argument, why he thinks he did it right, and you'll decide who read the code right, who's got it right or wrong. So, excuse me. So appeals, I think they're fun. You may disagree if you have one, but that is something that is within your jurisdiction. And I covered that already. Like variations, granting an appeal, overturning the zoning administrator requires 4 affirmative votes. As I mentioned before, whatever comes of that, whoever loses can take it to circuit court on administrative review.
So that was your jurisdiction. Now let's transition over to the Open Meetings Act. This applies to public bodies. Public bodies include subsidiaries of city councils, villages. That includes yourselves. And so we want to kind of break down what a meeting is. And there's three essential elements. It's a gathering, and what is it a gathering of? It's a gathering of a majority of a quorum. You are a seven-person council, so quorum is four of the seven. Majority of the four is three, it's not two. And so it's a gathering of, in your case, three. And what is that gathering of a majority of a quorum doing? It is discussing the public business. And so, in your case, two of you can meet, two of you can discuss the public business, and you would not run afoul of the Open Meetings Act. The minute you go to three, however, that is the majority of the quorum. You are discussing public business, and hopefully you will have properly noticed up that meeting, because it is a meeting. So, breaking this down a little further, what is a gathering? A gathering is a contemporaneous communication, and that includes in person, obviously, text messages, social media. There is, and you can see the various other examples here. Here's an example of where you can run afoul on social media. Let's say there's a commissioner who makes a public post on Facebook and makes a comment about the public business. Another commissioner comments and says, I agree with you, that's correct. The third commissioner has been watching this exchange. That becomes a meeting. That is three of you, that is a contemporaneous communication. And so the key takeaways here, what we want you to come away with is best practices, and that is you want to limit your communications to less than a majority of the quorum. You don't want to, in the case of an email, reply all. I'm sure you've heard that before. And there will be FOIA implications to all of these. We'll get into that a little later.
And I don't know why if you want to spend your time on social media talking about zoning board business, you can in theory, but this is the third rail of this. It's just, I've said a little even more extremely. Don't post social media about zoning board business. It's just not worth it. If you really want to talk about it, let's call a meeting. We'll talk about how you do that. And the other issue, and Marcus hinted at this, the issue is not the first person who says something. It's not the first email or the first post. It's the response in the presence of a third person. And it can be done so unwittingly. I see people, we see people, veterans of municipal government err on this stuff. So we get it. It's hard out there. It's very easy just to fire off something on a text, an email, or social media. Just, it's a great discipline to try to have. Just, it's not worth talking about it. Not in that forum.
Okay, another test. I know you guys like them. So let's assume this is a zoning board. Is what they're doing permissible, and under what circumstances would it be permissible under the OMA? Can you think of scenarios where you essentially are not violating the Open Meetings Act here?
If you're not talking about zoning board business.
Correct.
Are those all zoning board members?
Yes.
Let's assume they
So for
are.
the-
Yeah.
Has the meeting been called to order?
So if this is a properly convened meeting,
Well, it hasn't been called to order.
That's a good question.
yeah.
If it's before the meeting's been called to order, it's not allowed.
Very good. That's correct.
Anything else?
It's an ugly tie.
That is,
That's not an OMA concern.
Am I allowed to joke about three old white guys and one woman and all those things? But
If he can joke about the dress code, sure. why
in
not?
red, too. It's always comes down to the appearance of impropriety, and
That's a concern. That's a concern.
Unless you're in the Supreme Court, then it's never.
Right.
anything goes.
other considerations
Who are
might
the
be,
people in the back there? How many people are on this board?
It's not the best picture. Just run with us here, okay?
Well,
I think that's a pretty good point.
People there, what's the quorum?
Maybe it's a massive board, right?
Right, so this could
20
be
people.
less than a majority of the quorum, so what would be allowed?
It always takes me a second to break it down and
Right.
say, okay, what's the majority, what's the quorum? And then You know, so yeah, this may very well
It's a
be.
14-person board, that these 5 people would be
Maybe you
less than a
should budget
majority.
for a better picture.
I guess we're gonna have to, yeah.
Look at all the questions we get.
You've hit all the high points, and that's exactly right. I think we like to use this to illustrate the issue that Vice Chair Bay hit first, although I think the other comments are all right on point as well. We don't know what they're talking about, but it might be an appearance of impropriety. There was actually just a case, I think it came out, was it today, Marcus? We just got an alert about it today. A challenge on Open Meetings Act for members of, I think, a city council downstate at a political rally. And the public access counselor said, there's no evidence they were talking about public business. The fact that they were all together is not itself a violation. So you can do it. I would be mindful, though, as you mentioned, Member Yablon, it might look funny, but you're not prohibited from being together and talking about baseball games and, you know, where you're going on vacation. That's not a problem. So at that point, we talked about this, what is not public business. In your case, public business, I would say err on the side of caution. Anything that's land use related is probably something I consider public business. Not just those applications that are before you, but maybe things that could come before you. Your jurisdiction is a little more limited in that regard than something like the Planning Commission. You don't have a mandatory authority. But anything that's a zoning interpretation could come your way. So I'd stay away from those land use and zoning topics as a general rule, unless you're at a notice meeting and the gavel's been struck. Mark has mentioned this, don't reply all, just don't reply all. Don't do it.
What's the proper mechanism or the procedure, I should say, if somebody were to call you as a friend or acquaintance or whatever, say, oh, I know you're on the zoning board, can I ask you some questions?
So you're jumping ahead, but you have questions about our application next week? Come to the meeting. Right, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but this is the record. You're only supposed to consider what is presented before you, and the applicant bears the burden of proof. What you're considering that's not at the hearing presents a due process problem. So someone comes up to you and says, I've got some issues, I want to tell you about them, come to the meeting. Can't come to the meeting? Send a letter into Carl, send your opinion in, it'll get posted in the packet or read here at the hearing, whatever it may be.
What if someone's seeking advice as to whether or not they should start the process?
They should go to staff.
Get the various.
Yeah, we'll talk about that a little in the ethics guidelines. You should not be involved in anyone's decision about whether and how to involve themselves in the zoning process. Whether because they want to oppose something that's before you, or they might want to initiate some relief. How do I might want to add an addition to my property, my aging parents are moving in. How do I do that? Call Carl. So. Carl can do it. Right, Carl? Yes. There you go.
Change his name to Saul.
This is me. Real quick, you have to have it, right? So what can you do? When you have a meeting that's properly noticed, which means having an agenda, we have to post it 48 hours in advance. We have to take minutes of our meetings. You always approve them at the next meeting. Once you're there, you can talk about whatever you want. You can consider items that are not on an agenda. We are here to properly notice meeting of the Zoning Board of Appeals tonight. There are certain items on your agenda. You had the one variation that was requested. You had this training. We can talk about whatever you want to until you move to adjourn. You can't take final action on anything for a matter that's not on the agenda. It's a little less of an issue for a zoning board because you're only taking action on applications before you. That's a bigger issue for entities like the city council. But you can talk about whatever you want once you're at a notice meeting. So that's why you're on the, hey, I want to talk on social media about an issue, call a meeting. Come to the meeting. Have it out. That's how you do it. If you take action on something that's not on the agenda, it can be voided through a judicial proceeding. And that's not fun.
So not much to say about this, other than you're required to take the Public Access Counselor's Open Meetings Act training within 90 days of being appointed.
You've all done this, I presume? Yeah. Okay, good.
It's a fun test. I do like it. And so, it was down a few years.
Yeah, they had some technical problems, but it's back up now.
It's been back up. What can happen if you violate the Open Meetings Act? A civil suit can be brought against you. It's punishable by, I believe, up to $1,500 fine. It's punishable by imprisonment as well, 30 days imprisonment. It's subject to review by the Public Access Counselor. I'll call him PAC going forward. And typically what they do is they issue binding, or more commonly non-binding opinions on violations of the Open Meetings Act and of the Freedom of Information Act.
The less neighbors, don't be the first zoning board member to go to OMA jail. That would be a bad legacy. So. All right, so we'll talk briefly about FOIA. FOIA does not really affect you much, except when it does, and there's one thing that Mark's will talk about. Very generally, public records of the city are presumed to be open for inspection and copying. There's a general rule that what happens here at City Hall, what relates to city business, is the public's business. And subject only to certain exceptions, if the member of the public asks for a record, it's presumed to be available to them. So then the question, and I'm going to ask Marcus to answer it, are you subject to FOIA? You are not city employees. You do not have city email addresses. You come here every other Thursday, and then you go home. And it's only in certain times when you have any official role at all. So are you subject to FOIA? Marcus will answer that question for us.
Unless one of you would like to answer it. So generally not. However, with a big old asterisk, in cases where you're convened as a public body, there was a case out of Champaign, City of Champaign versus Madigan, where a reporter requested records. The reporter could see that the city council of the City of Champaign was exchanging text messages while on the dais, and they wanted to know what they were discussing, and so they FOIA'd it. The court found that while they were convened, they were discussing the public business, it was a meeting, and the records produced during that meeting were subject to FOIA.
And importantly, it was all on private devices. And that was the defense that the city gave. Said, it's not, we don't have these.
And these aren't city cell phones.
Didn't matter.
So speaking hypothetically, of course, if during the days when we had Zoom, the meetings by Zoom, if one board member was to text another board member saying, what do you think about this case? That would be subject to FOIA.
Gavel to gavel. Gavel to gavel, you are now the public body, and what you do up there is considered public business, and it doesn't matter whose computer or phones those are. If we got a FOIA request for all text messages sent by the members of the zoning board during their May 18th meeting, we'd have to come to each of you and say, you got to send us your text messages. We got to evaluate them and maybe release them.
Even ones that weren't related to zoning board business?
We'd have to evaluate them at a minimum. We'd have to double check.
Yep, and that's kind of what the next case talks about. It's an expansion of the Champaign case. This is the Better Government Association versus the City of Chicago. The main takeaways here are records can become public. They can become public records if the correspondence is sent to a majority of the quorum. It is sufficient, this is the second point, that communications were prepared for or used by, received by, or in the possession of a public body.
And again, you are the public body when you're up here in a notice meeting. All right, switching gears, we've done sunshine laws. Robert's Rules of Order, I know you know this, but we'll cover it briefly. Motions, there has to be a motion in order to do something. The chair or whoever is presiding over the meeting should not make a motion. A chairman can second a motion. Motions have to be seconded by someone or other. The guidance in Roberts is that if you make the motion, you should not speak against it. You can vote against it. Making a motion is essentially, I want us to make a decision on a certain proposition. You can be persuaded to vote against the very proposition you wanted to vote for, but you shouldn't be the one to speak against it. It's just, Roberts doesn't smile upon that. If you're the seconder, you can. You have a question?
Yeah, so the way that we typically run the meetings is that we discuss where we stand before we take a vote. So if all of us are saying, for those watching at home, no, can you say negative things and then make a motion?
Sure. But I said you can't speak against the motion. The motion could be, I move to deny. So to speak for the motion would be to talk about how the variation is such a bad idea. If you make a motion to deny and then you say, and I think we should approve this, that's what you shouldn't do. Can you talk against approval? Absolutely.
Okay.
And I should also say, Roberts, this is a debate among parliamentarians, and I will say that I love parliamentary procedure. I give separate training sessions strictly on parliamentary procedure. It's meant as a tool for efficient and effective decision-making, which is to say to get to the will of the public body. But Roberts doesn't always apply cleanly to public bodies. It's not written for that.
I was going to ask, is a violation of Robert's rule evidence that can be used in an administrative review, or?
Maybe, I suppose I suppose if there was some egregious, it might speak to a due process problem, but it would be a pretty extreme example. You get to set your procedure. You're not bound by Roberts. Roberts is our default. Roberts contemplates that you don't discuss anything until there's a motion. Right? That's, and trained parliamentarians have argued with me that you've got to have the motion first, then you discuss. I don't subscribe to that. I'm not such a technocrat when it comes to that. I think, so this is a technical Roberts rule, but I think it's still good guidance. In the case of the zoning board, I think it's great you discuss it first. You're trying to get to where the consensus is. And more times than not, I know I've been here enough, you get there. You figure out, are we going to move to approve this? And if so, are there any conditions we want to add into the order? What are we doing here? That's great. When the motion comes, if there's any need for further discussion, Roberts just counsels, don't speak against it if you're the motion maker. If you're not prepared to say anything for it, then maybe you shouldn't make the motion at all.
And I think our procedure for discussing it before we make a motion helps the applicant. Because if it's clear that they're not going to get it.
Yeah, tremendous.
Then, we generally give them the option
Yeah.
to withdraw it, continue it, or
I agree completely.
roll the dice and see what happens.
I agree completely.
So-
Go ahead,
Oh,
Mark.
I'm sorry, no, I think this is you.
Very briefly, and again, this is the one we highlight every year. The motion to table is a commonly heard phrase. It is almost always used incorrectly. A motion to table is it's meant for long legislative sessions, things like the General Assembly and Congress, when you set aside whatever you're talking about on a temporary basis because there's something more urgent that's come up, whatever it might be. There's a fight in the other room, there's someone storming the castle, what have you, we have to do something different. It's not meant to put an item off for the next meeting. That's a motion to continue. The reason why I point that out, say, who cares, right? The reason why it matters is when you do a motion to table, you can't actually get it back on an agenda until there's a motion to take it off the table. And that is a clunky process. It's in one of those places where Roberts doesn't really fit what we're doing, but used incorrectly, it can cause a due process problem. So my recommendation, the point of this slide is, if you have an item before you and you want to talk about it another day, don't say you move to table it, move to continue it. That's the proper usage here for the zoning board. And that's true actually for all city boards and commissions. That's my advice to all of our municipal clients. You want a motion to continue. We'll save the tabling for Springfield and Washington.
In my experience, motions to reconsider generally come up on more controversial items, though I've seen it on something as innocuous as minutes. Motions to reconsider can only be at the same meeting in which the item was heard and voted upon. A motion to reconsider can only be brought by a member on the prevailing side. And so, it just makes sense. I can see it being used as a tool if you're allowed to be on the losing side and then just motion it up in order to hopefully subvert the will, the vote of the body. Motions to reconsider are appropriate when a vote passes and a commissioner realizes that something's wrong. There's something that they hadn't considered before when they voted to pass it, and so that's when it comes up. If a motion to reconsider passes, it essentially brings you right back to the point before the initial vote, and so it undoes everything. So let's transition now from Robert's rules to Clarence versus the Village of Lisle. And the implications of this particular Supreme Court case are pretty massive. What this stands for is that interested parties in a zoning board hearing are entitled to due process rights. They can present evidence testimony, expert witnesses, they can subpoena records, they have a right to cross-examine, they have a right to ask for a continuance. Clarence doesn't necessarily say that they automatically get that continuance, but they have a right to ask. Due process attaches to everyone at the hearing.
Marcus, how do you determine, you use the phrase, interested parties? If someone, and not too far-fetched, if someone comes in here and they live 2 blocks away and they say, we're concerned about the drainage that this construction is going to
And they came
have
to
on
the hearing?
And they come to the hearing. Yeah,
They're
I
an
mean,
interested party.
they're an
To
interested
some extent, we have, though, this is a great, that was one of the troubling parts of Claren when it came down. That's the case about 20 years. A lot of Claren's been undone by the legislature in terms of what happens in a court review. But this slide does illustrate, as Marcus said, there's due process in this room for anyone who is an interested party. One thing that the city and others have done is they've said, if you want to be called an interested party, you got to register with us. And if you look at our notices, our standard notes say, if you want to be an interested party, you've got to register. You want the right to cross-examine, you've got to register. So someone who saunters in here and says, oh, I have an opinion on that, is probably not an interested party.
But just the mere fact that you register makes you a de facto interested party.
Yeah. Doesn't happen very often.
Do you have the right at some point to cut people off if they're being increasingly repetitive?
Yes, we'll talk about that in a minute.
Okay.
Yeah.
What practical implications does this right to due process have? For starters, you shouldn't be engaging in ex-parte communications. We touched on this earlier. Simply put, that means communications with one side and not the other. Of course, this doesn't include staff. Staff is not a party. It's important that all the communications about an application happen at the hearing. Another thing you shouldn't consider is evidence that's not presented at the hearing. Due process demands that interested parties, like we were just talking about, have an opportunity to know the factors that you're weighing in considering the application. Let's say you close testimony and you know something about this particular property, this particular application, and the other side, the objectors, the applicants, have already given their statements. Now you're all discussing it, and you say, oh, I know something about this property. It's such and such. Due process considerations come up because now the applicant, the objectors don't have an opportunity to rebut this evidence that you've brought from outside. It should have come out at the hearing while there was testimony. You're free to ask questions of the applicant, questions of the objector, so that they can fully address them. Also, you don't want to conduct your own investigations. Like I said, everything that you consider should be stated at the hearing. And so going out to the property, looking things up on your own is something
We had somebody
advise.
accuse us of doing that.
And it's tough. It's a great point, Marcus.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a great point. And you all, some of you have lived here for a very long time. Or maybe you've lived here for a minute and a half, but the application comes a block away, and as Mark said, you know something about the property. You've seen something there. You can't avoid that. But if it's on your mind, you got to give the folks who were here debating it the chance. Isn't this the property where, in 1974, there was the fire? Is that, right? If that's on your mind, you get it out there during the testimony, as Marcus said, because then they could, oh, yes, that's right, or, well, that's true, but it's not relevant, here's why. Let them have it out. The worst thing to happen is when you're getting to that discussion at the end, say, I'm voting against this because of the 1974 fire. Well, what's that about? That wasn't on the record.
Or maybe it was across the street.
Right, you could have been wrong, right? So that's why this all gets to, you just got to, we want to air it out here. Get it on the record. That preserves your ability to issue what I think is a proper ruling. So we actually talked about this a little bit. You know the answer. Our hypothetical is it's not someone calling you. It's someone who comes to your barbecue and they want to discuss a variation. We've already said, what do?
Ask Carl.
Ask Carl, or come to the meeting. Send a letter, come to the meeting. Do not have that discussion outside a hearing. I love this picture. This gets to what we just talked about. You do your homework, not your own investigation. It's just not your job to go more into it. That doesn't mean, as I said, that you forget what you know. You know what you know. But it is the applicant's burden to make their case. Let them do it. And if they fail, you can tell them that they failed and vote them down.
What happens when someone from the public comes in and they say, I didn't receive anything in the mail about this, I didn't receive notice? Well, if they're here, what you do is nothing, because notice is there to allow someone the opportunity to be present. They're present. That is the purpose of notice, so they wouldn't have a claim. Sometimes we might hear before a hearing that there was a problem with notice. And if it's particularly egregious, the best course of action is to renotice and set it for another date. If it's not egregious, if it's somewhere in a gray area, that is perhaps a decision best left to the applicant, because they're the ones who are going to have to live with whatever they decide. If the application is approved and they start work, and then within the time frame it's challenged and overturned, that's really something that, you know, they rolled the dice and they lost.
A lot of this often happens at staff level, but I know sometimes someone comes in and says we didn't get the proper notice, and I think that construct, Marcus, is the right way to handle
I
it.
assume if somebody attests to the fact that they did give proper notice, there's a rebuttable presumption that they did.
And that gets to the point Marcus made, which is if, you know, so again, if the person's here, I didn't get a notice, well, you're here, so you didn't need one. If somehow, and I don't know what it would be, there's a problem that's identified, we'll do this, and we'll get these calls from Carl and his counterparts in other towns all the time, and said, ask the applicant what they want to do. Do they want to take the risk? And I've had it go both ways. I had it happen in another town with a school district. There was notice something was off in the notice in a school district, and everybody knew what they were doing. They said, you know what, let's go back to another hearing. Because they didn't want to have, they made a decision not to take on the risk that someone would say they didn't get properly noticed. So we try to remove you and us all from that decision. Once in a while, it's something that's so egregious, and as Marcus said, it's, no, you can't do this, we got to start over.
Yeah, renotice.
Yeah.
So the key thing here is consistency. For public comment, you want to enforce consistent timeframes. It's, if you set a limit of 3 minutes, it should be 3 minutes for everyone. You don't want to be seen as playing favorites or giving one objector more time. If one person gets to speak endlessly, it becomes that much more difficult when the next person wants to go way over their 3 minutes, and so it's best to just keep a rein on it right at the beginning. Or if someone wants to talk again after their initial 3 minutes, and that person's allowed, it becomes once again more difficult to say to the next person, you can't talk again. And so consistency is key. The applicant, of course, gets more time. It's their burden to prove that they've met the standards. Another thing is cheering and booing. Discourage that. That's disruptive. That's disruptive to the public business.
It's usually only the board that does the cheering and booing.
Totally allowed. No. And so, you know, you want to control the crowd, gets out of hand pretty quickly. People can come, they can provide their testimony, and it's fruitful, but cheering, booing, like I said, it's a disruption. It doesn't add anything to the consideration of the matter. Setting the tone early is very important. You want to keep things respectful.
We're pretty much a free-for-all as far as allowing people to express themselves, and we've contemplated on occasion that, you know, should we set a curfew? Should we set, I mean, if we wanted to do that and just say, you know what, we're, under no circumstance are we going to go beyond 11:30. Could we do that and just make it part of our, and if so, what would be the procedure to do that?
So what we have, and I'm not sure for the zoning board, but in the Plan and Design Commission for our rules of procedure, there's specific language in there that says the chairman can pretty much call it after 10:30. And we continue all remaining cases to a date certain.
Yeah, I would say that's right. I don't know that you have to have that rule in advance. You could decide on a given night, we're going to stop at X o'clock. You just have a motion to continue, as Margaret said. I don't know that you need to have, you know, we know this, right? Most of your applications are similar to what we had tonight. You have the applicant and maybe one objector. So I don't have a problem, and you should have a problem. Let them talk. You can set a different rule for the next hearing. If the folks for the second one that come in, there's 50 people in the room, you might say, for this hearing, we can't have this go on for 10 hours, so we're going to impose a 3-minute rule here. Should you probably do it for all of them? Maybe, might make sense. Most public bodies that I've seen, when they start to impose time limits, they end up doing it universally.
There's been some talk about setting a precedent is if we know one matter on the agenda, the first matter is going to be a lengthy matter. The second one's likely to be very quickly, very quick. Can we change the order on the agenda?
Absolutely.
And that's just totally.
By acclamation of the board, yeah.
Does it have to be motion to do that?
Technically, no. I think the Robert's Rules allows if the chair can say, I'd like to rearrange the order if there's no objection from the board. And so if there's an objection, you probably have to have a motion and see if the majority controls. All right, I'm sorry, Alexa.
Sorry, just a quick one, and that is, it's just an assumption that I make, and I've always been very impressed by how these meetings are run, and that I feel that people leave here feeling that they were heard. They might not be agreed with, but they've been heard. Am I right to assume that that keeps litigation down?
Yes, absolutely. Following the people, right, that's so much of local government. Someone just wants a chance to express what's on their mind. Most people, in most circumstances, know they're not always going to get their way. Some don't understand that, and so lawyers have jobs. All right, let's talk last of the city's ethics guidelines. Highland Park is pretty unique. We've got a pretty robust set of ethics guidelines. You should have received a copy of this. First adopted in 2007, amended 3 times since, most recently January 2020 when the world was normal. Very, very general summary. Interest in city contracts. This doesn't affect you quite as much. This is much more for city council. But city officials and employees can't have a direct or indirect interest in contracts that the city's entering into. And that's not a matter of recusal. It's a prohibition. That's reflective of state law also. If you have an interest in a city contract, your decision is not whether to recuse or not. It's either keep the business and lose your seat or keep your seat and lose the business. That's just the way that our law works in Illinois, and the ethics guidelines reflect that. There are restrictions on representations before other boards and commissions. It's pretty broad. The city council has directed that the land use commissions in particular should not be representing applicants before other bodies of the city of Highland Park. That's something that the council wants to keep you as an official and not as an advocate before city governing bodies. And then where it comes up most often are disclosure and recusal requirements when you have a connection to an application, when you have to disclose that, and under what of those circumstances you have to actually recuse yourself from the consideration.
So going into that specific disclosure and recusal requirement, you must disclose and recuse if you have a current relationship with an applicant where you represent them, whether you're a lawyer, accountant, architect, and you must recuse yourself, you disclose that relationship. You must also disclose and recuse if you no longer represent the applicant, but you did and you represented them on a matter related to the application. Another thing, obviously, if the applicant is a family member, you have to disclose and recuse. Business relationship. You have to disclose and recuse if you are, for instance, an owner, officer, director, or employee of the applicant. It's been said many times, and Hart just said it again, the appearance of impropriety is often worse than the actual impropriety. So, you want to try to avoid reasonable accusations of some sort of wrongdoing, some sort of, like I said, appearance of impropriety.
One thing I'll stress there, and it's something that comes up often, merely knowing the applicant socially is not improper. Highland Park is not actually that big of a community. I know it's large compared to other suburbs, but it's not huge. You will know people if you haven't already.
Should that be disclosed?
Maybe, depending on the circumstances, but the best man at your wedding can be before you for an application. That in and of itself, and unless you can't be impartial about it, but you're going to know the people that come before you. It's just the nature of the beast in a community like this one. So that in and of itself is not enough. The closer it gets to, something about yourself or your business, that's when it may be improper if it doesn't fall within one of the other categories that's specifically identified.
Yeah, appearance of impropriety is so fact-specific. Generally, it's really up to you to make this determination. So let's talk about instances in which disclosure is required, but not necessarily recusal. If you previously represented the client on an unrelated matter to the application, you must disclose you need not recuse. When you're a member of a nonprofit or a volunteer for them, again, disclosure, not recusal, not necessarily recusal. Generally speaking, if your relationship to the applicant doesn't involve compensation or decision-making authority, disclosure but not recusal. And of course, if you yourself are the applicant. Whether a ZBA member can represent someone before city staff depends on three factors. Depends on which department. Like Hart said, land use commissions have very specific requirements in the ethics guidelines. You are restricted as to your engagement with the community development department. You can engage with staff of the other city departments. The next factor is this a matter of a type that may reasonably be before the ZBA or the Plan and Design Commission? If so, if it's one of those matters, you are restricted from representing that person before city staff. Finally, is this an administrative matter or is this a discretionary matter? This relates to what the staff has to do with the application. If you want to talk with a city department and it's about a matter in which the city has discretion and the matter might appear before this body or the Plan and Design Commission, you cannot represent that applicant before city staff.
Basically, less of all this is the guidelines want you to be very thoughtful about doing business in the city with the city government. There are ways to do it, but trying to really observe that you're part of the land use scheme and keeping you separate from the administrative functions, it may just be a good idea. You made it. You even passed the quizzes, so.
So no cheering and booing?
You want to cheer us. We're not going to know what to do with it. We don't get it often, but we'll take it.
Up here.
Yeah, and seriously, any questions?
Yeah, this was just one that's come up before. Since when we grant variance, it's forever, the ability to put time limits on things. Like, we had a fence case where it was like the creepy neighbor and one of my questions at the time had been, and I think we ended up just granting it, but to say, okay, we understand that this is a problem, and there were other things going on, but that this 8-foot fence isn't for the life of the property. Could we have the 8-foot fence for the life of the fence? And say an average wood fence lives 25 years, so you have a 35-year variance.
Can you do that as a question?
Yeah.
I mean, the simple answer is if the applicant doesn't object to a condition like that, then yes. Legally, if we can tie it back to what the hardship is, I suppose. It's a little hard to conceive, and that's an interesting example. Where, it's not self-created by the applicant, right? There's the case of the creepy neighbor. We're going to have to put that up on the slide for next time. There are so few of them in Highland Park, really.
Yeah.
Get some good images for that.
Right. Maybe.
Well, as a practical matter, we could do it just by saying we're not going to approve it unless it has a duration on it.
Well, I know we were able to do it for the mobile classrooms at Elm Place, that they were willing to put a timeline on it.
If there may be, so the best example might be someone has a use that they are saying themselves is temporary, but there's a physical hardship related to that. Say, we're going to be here for 5 years, and so we only need this for 5 years, whatever this is. That's pretty logical. That gets, again, though, to if the applicant's willing to agree to a condition, then there's no one left to challenge it,
Right, and then
if you're granted.
we also said if it changes, then you have to come back and, go through the process again.
Right. Now, if the applicant's not, if you say, hey, I'll let you have this variation, but it's got a 20-year period on it, whatever it is, and the applicant says, I want this permanently, so you deny it, and that becomes the court fight, my argument would have to be, our argument would be, well, the condition was related to the hardship and the standards. And the zoning board was on solid ground in saying the standards are only met if we have a limited duration of this. I don't know how that would play out. I'm a little skeptical as a general proposition that it's a proper condition, but on a case by case, it might be, and maybe this is a good example. Yeah. Well,
Thank you so much.
we'll be back, we will be back next year if not before, but we are available. You haven't adjourned yet? Don't do it, yeah, right? We're gonna stop our presentation, but no. Thank you as always for having us here. We are available whenever you need, if certainly there's an ethics question, we are the city's ethics officers, so you can always reach out to us if you have a question on the ethics guidelines. More generally, anything that we can ever do to help the zoning board, just say the word, one or more of us will be here to assist. We love doing that, so thank you for allowing us to serve in that role.
Thank you. All right. It having appeared that the legal training has concluded, the next item on the agenda is adjournment, and accordingly, I would
Motion to adjourn.
I would first like to get the words out of my mouth, but yeah.
Remember, you have 1 second.
All right. All in favor of adjournment, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We are adjourned.
Thank you, everyone.